Is Ukraine a democracy?
Well, increasingly, it isn't a democracy. Of course, Zelensky isn't elected, but then the provision for that is allowed for in Ukrainian constitution under martial law. Of course, that's an argument to bring the war to an end and hold presidential elections, of course. But there has been a clamping down on political dissent within Ukraine. Political oppositionists have been directly targeted. There's no real independent media in Ukraine anymore, and corruption is at a grand state level, very much driven, some would argue, from the top. There was an interview with the Guardian newspaper, British newspaper, back in 2023, early 2023, with another anti-corruption commission called the National Agency of Preventing Corruption in Ukraine. And at that time, they were alleging that a lot of the corruption in Ukraine centers around the office of the president himself. I think this is a really, really big deal right now, for Zelensky, and him doubling down and actually sort of putting more pressure on dissent is going to cause big problems for him, I think, going forward, because politicians ultimately follow the will of the people, largely for self-preservation purposes, to keep their jobs, in elected office. And the more these, public protests grow, if they grow, then politicians will increasingly come out, as this brave MP has done so.
And what we're seeing, that obviously is kind of growing even within Ukraine, and we'll see where these protests go. If this was just a one-off and then the law doesn't change and they just shrug their shoulders and say, well, we tried, or if it continues on, because this could obviously escalate within Ukraine, but it also has ramifications outside of Ukraine. There has been a concerted effort, certainly by Zelensky, but also among many in Europe, to fast track European Union membership for Ukraine. Everybody's not on board that. One of the key ones is Hungary. Now, Hungary is opposed to it, not just because of the corruption, but because of some things that are happening inside of Ukraine on Hungarian ethnic citizens. And the foreign minister came out and again talked about why he is opposed to EU membership for Ukraine.
The president of Zelensky sees Hungary, the Hungarian nation, including the Hungarians living in the Carpathian Mountains, as extremely hostile. He sees Hungary, the Hungarian people, as an obvious enemy. This has become clear to everyone over the past few years, because for many years now they have been taking away and suppressing the rights of the Hungarians in the Carpathian Mountains. These legal provisions have led to the lighting of the church, to the death of a Hungarian. Because he does not want to go to war, he does not want to take part in a senseless slaughter. From this point of view, this threat by the president of Zelensky only reinforces the fact that he is seen as an enemy. I would like to make it clear that no matter how much the president of Zelensky threatens, Hungary does not support Ukraine's joining the European Union. No matter how much he threatens, no matter how much he tries to threaten Brussels.
That's a pretty strong statement there, a pair of statements actually. He says that, he claims anyway, that that Ukraine sees Hungary as an enemy and therefore some of their people. But then he also says, yeah, and I think that he's an enemy too. What do you make of that?
Well, there's been an incredibly hostile relationship between Ukraine and Hungary, since really the start of the year, when Viktor Orban was talking out against, this senseless war from the very beginning. He was the first and only one to do so at the time. And of course, the ethno-nationalism, the kind of clamping down on the use of Russian language also applies to other languages, and that includes Hungarian languages used by the minorities in the Carpathian Mountains. So while the kind of clamping down on cultural rights and freedoms of Russian speakers has gained a lot of spotlight, this is also very relevant to Hungary, too. And I think the Hungarians feel that this issue has never really been addressed, that Zelensky doesn't care anyway, because he's pushing this kind of Ukrainian sort of ultra-nationalist ethnocentric agenda here, and Hungarians are being marginalized because of that. So I think, in addition to that, you have the energy question where, Ukraine shut off the pipeline through to Europe. High energy prices are being forced on Hungary. The European Commission is forcing them to stop using sort of Russian gas. They've now started building a pipeline into Serbia to get around that. I actually saw Sujato up close and personal in Budapest about 2 or 3 weeks ago at an event I went to, actually with Professor John Mearsheimer, who was there too. Very nice to meet him in person. But you know, they're very, very clear on this. I mean, this war is costing Hungary a lot of money, and it's disadvantaging Hungarian people, you know, in Ukraine, and they don't want any part of it. They want the war to end, and actually, they're really not that keen on the costs involved of bringing Ukraine into the EU.
Now, Hungary, as you mentioned, Viktor Orban has been against this war from the outset and has been pretty outspoken about it. But do you see any kind of a willingness among others in the European Union? Obviously, Slovakia is one, but are there others that may be saying, you know, they kind of got a point? And when stuff like this happens, is that going to potentially move others in Europe away from granting EU membership?
Well, it certainly will. But I mean, I think the big deal breaker on EU membership in any case, Danny, is money. I think the biggest blocker of EU membership will actually be Poland, you know, believe it or not, because Poland is a massive net beneficiary of EU subsidies. It gets more EU subsidies than any other European Union country, and would lose all of those billion. I think about 6 billion net a year. It would lose those and end up paying into the EU pot, basically giving all their 6 billion and more euros a year directly to Ukraine, benefiting Ukrainian farmers at the expense of Polish farmers. Believe you me, setting aside the whole cultural, ethnic issues and the issues around corruption, which will also be convenient blockers for states like Hungary, you know, Poland will block it anyway on financial grounds. And, you know, the French war too, I don't know how familiar you are with how belligerent French farmers are when they feel their subsidies are being attacked, but believe you me, they will be a major blocker too. So I think the road to membership is going to be a very long and hard one for Ukraine. At this stage, this latest revelation, I fear, pushes it further down the track to 10 years and well beyond that, I suspect.
Now I know with NATO, it's a unity. Everybody has to vote against it or any new member, or they don't come in. Is there a similar provision in the EU, or does it have to just be some kind of majority? Yeah,
there is, although don't underestimate von der Leyen's propensity to maybe change the rules to suit her. But there are lots of different stages to the membership process, different chapters like on agriculture and all the justice and all and that sort of thing. At every stage, every single member state has to agree that the aspirant country has met all of the requirements and can block it in any state along the way. So it's much more complicated than NATO when it's a yes or no. You know, Hungary and Poland and France can block it for years and years and years, just at each of the stages along the way. It's kind of
let's look at the fundamentals here. What is the purpose of the European Union? I mean, I think that's important, because if it's just to, hey, let's get as many people as we can against Russia, that's one set of criteria. But if it's actually, we want the economic stability of every member nation and the whole group at large to improve, then it seems like you would only want to invite somebody in who's going to provide some sort of net positive. Doesn't seem like Ukraine would meet that threshold ever.
Well, the Ukrainian people are great, well-educated, bright, enthusiastic, and would be a good fit. But the problem is the cost. Ukraine is just so much poorer, you know, than the rest of the EU. Now, the EU was really set up as an economic, social, and cultural community in the aftermath of World War II to allow people to get better political relationships through economics, trade, just cultural collaboration, and that sort of thing. And it's kind of left that and become far too political and focused on containing Russia to its detriment. You know, actually, but the problem for Ukraine, in fact, is that actually one of the 3 most wealthy countries in the EU has left, and that's us, you know, the United Kingdom. And the whole kind of EU settlement is based on the rich countries subsidizing the poorer countries. Well, the EU has fewer rich countries now, and Ukraine is by a country mile the poorest country in Europe. So the costs of bringing Ukraine in are just, frankly, just too high, and that leaves Ukraine facing a sort of second-class citizen membership, like, you know, cattle class, you know, in some really bad airline, but even worse, you know, sat by the toilets. And whether Ukrainian people feel that meets their aspirations, having lost upwards of 500,000 people in a preventable war against Russia, I mean, it's going to be a massive challenge, both for Ukraine, but also actually for the mainstream political movements in Europe itself.
Well, and as you mentioned, that Poland is maybe a bigger stick in the mud than many people in the United States anyway recognize. I wonder if you could address just real quickly the balancing act that Poland has to do, because in some regards they're Ukraine's biggest cheerleader and biggest advocate, etc. But then when you start talking about farmers and agricultural products, it gets a little more dicey. So how do they manage that to keep their population happy, but also keep the facade of European unity supporting Ukraine?
Well, they've been very pro, Ukraine fighting Russia, because obviously dating back to World War II, Poland has a very kind of complex, relationship with Russia. But right at the start of the war, Polish farmers came out in protest against cheap Ukrainian grain flooding into their country after the war, broke out. So they've actually kind of blocked moves. In fact, the European Commission took away Ukrainian preferential agricultural rights actually during the course of the war, believe it or not, partly on the back of Polish protests and protests from other countries like France. So, Sikorski has been saying, let's keep fighting Russia, but actually let's not have cheap Ukrainian grain. And that's how they've been doing it. And by the way, the Poles have also been saying, well, let's force these migrant young Ukrainian men back to Ukraine rather than letting them take Polish kind of welfare benefits as well. So Poland has had a bizarre, frankly, unhelpful and quite ugly, I have to say, positioning on this war.
Yeah, and that's just something that's going to be hard to navigate. Again, it just sort of speaks to the lack of actual unity among all the European, because of the different economic as well as military aspects that are going into this. But if I showed a while ago that Hungary claims that Ukraine sees them as an enemy, that they see Zelensky as an enemy, somebody else sees an enemy here, and that's Sergei Lavrov against the entire European Union. He argues in a recent interview here that this Russophobia is poisoning the water for any kind of settlement.
Europe has become furious. I cannot think of another word to describe it. They are displaying global arrogance towards the Russian Federation. In every possible way, they are inciting their people, indoctrinating them with Goebbels-esque propaganda that Russia is an eternal enemy and an existential threat. They are telling their people that Russia is about to attack Europe and that they should forget about social problems, economic failures, and deindustrialization in Germany and other European countries. They are telling their people to throw all their forces, all means and taxes exclusively into militarization of Europe.
Yeah, we certainly see a lot of that militarization of Europe, but of course many in Europe will say, well, that's just because you guys are coming after us and you're attacking everything, and if you get through with Ukraine, you're going to start rolling west, so we damn well better be ready. What do you say to those two very divergent views?
Well, it's taken Russia 18 months to advance about 40 miles in Donetsk. And it's, about another 900 miles to the Polish border. So you can do the maths. And actually, military affairs far better than I do. I've been hearing for over a decade that Russian tanks are going to roll into Latvia, Vilnius, Tallinn, Warsaw. There's never been any evidence or indication that was ever remotely likely. And for a long time, I was desperate not to believe that the UK, having been in the UK diplomatic service, as you know, Her Majesty's at the time diplomatic service, desperate to believe that we weren't Russophobic, we just had bad foreign policy. I now increasingly am sadly forced to, confront the possibility that in fact we are just, irrationally Russophobic. And actually what we really need to do is to have a big grand reset of relations with Russia and with Ukraine, so that all parties can coexist, focus on the economic, social and cultural collaboration. Sadly, I see no prospect for that anytime soon.